this discussion.
Sure. Well, afternoon, everybody. What we're going to do now is we're going to play the recording of the session because I had a co-host at the time, and then I'm going to come back for live Q&A. So as Chris mentioned, any questions that you have, feel free to put them in the chat box, and and then we'll get to it at the end. This will start with a little bit of banter, so just go along with it. I know it might be a little bit awkward, but there's a method to the madness, and we will talk about what we're doing with that. So go ahead, Chris.
Here we go.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get going in just a couple of minutes. Just so you know, we'll be moving in just a little bit here. I did hear a great statistic yesterday, though. Actually, it was last week. A newspaper article that said that 60% of people working from home now acknowledge that they drink on the job.
Really?
Yeah. Well, I'm comparing this, though, to here at Timmons Group, where we drive beer carts around the office, and I'd say 90% of the people that work at Timmons Group partake in the beer cart. Does that mean that actually stay at home is causing people to drink less? It's my theory.
I don't know, but I saw a meme yesterday, and this was great. So basically, it was a coffee mug, and the person took a tea, the little tea bag strings with the little tab that hangs.
Yep.
And they showed the person cutting the string, taping it to the inside of the coffee mug, and then pouring wine in it. So when they're in the meeting and they're drinking coffee.
That's a whole new level.
I was like, that's pretty clever.
I wish I had my tea bag right now. That would be really
right there.
helpful. And just everybody as everyone's coming in, we're going to get started right at just about 1 minute after 3:30. So I know we already have over almost 150 already on the line here as everyone's popping in. So keep coming in, and yeah, we're just getting ready to go in just a couple minutes.
Yeah, I thought that was a very funny meme. I'm like, that is not only funny, but clever.
Someone did it is the problem.
I was going to say, somebody had to think of it. So who's doing it? How many people are doing it? It's good.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Well, I'm looking at my background here, and I'm remembering I got these cars over my shoulder on this side. Did I ever tell you the story about these little guys?
No, I don't think I've heard the story.
Okay, so I got to grab one of them.
Okay.
This is, every year for Christmas, my kids ask me what I want for Christmas, literally every single year, and without fail, I have been asking for the exact same thing for, I think there's 10 cars over there, so for 10 years, which is I ask for a Porsche for Christmas, and every year I get a Porsche little tiny kit car. I'm waiting for the year that they actually buy me a Porsche. Like, one of these kids is going to be rich someday and is going to completely cover me with some 911 or something like that. But
got it. So you got a long-term play there going on.
I do.
You might want to give up on that dream after 10 years.
I'm still working it. Gonna keep pushing on it there.
Hold strong. One day.
Oh, so it looks like somebody's very happy that your pronunciation of Porsche was correct.
Yeah, Michael, thank you. I completely agree with you. In America, we often go and call a Porsche a Porsche. And Michael, you are dead on. It is definitely a Porsche because it's someone's last name. Actually, it was Mr. Porsche who started the car company. And the correct pronunciation thus ends in an A. And as everyone's coming on, we're well over 200 now. We're going to be getting going in just about a minute and a half, and just waiting for everyone to join in as Zoom's kind of putting everybody through and in. I will tell you, I was in a meeting just a couple days ago, and I heard got to tell us a great story about. So I don't drink beer too much. I'm a whiskey guy. And have you heard the story of the of Angel's Envy whiskey? Are you guys familiar with this?
Not familiar with it. No, I'm not a whiskey person.
I honestly love the name even more so than the whiskey itself. It's actually a bourbon, but whiskey is a bourbon. Bourbon is a whiskey. No, bourbon is a whiskey. Whiskey's not always a bourbon. There you go. The important facts for the day. But the name Angel's Envy comes from when you're, Susan, I completely agree saying you love Angel's Envy, but when you walk into a distillery, there you have, you'll have all of the barrels, all wood barrels around you. And it takes 2 to 4 years, depending on what bourbon you're drinking. And over the course of those 2 to 4 years, the actual alcohol seeps through the barrel and fills up the room. And basically, so you can smell the alcohol inside the room, as about 10 to 20% of the actual whiskey itself or alcohol actually dissipates through the wood barrels into the room. And and they call that the angel's share of the whiskey, because that's what seeps through the barrel. So I love the idea of angel's envy, is the idea that, you know, the angels are so jealous of what they actually get to drink inside the barrel.
And so Megan says that there's a documentary on whiskey and bourbon that you should check out if you're interested.
Did not know that. Megan, please put in those notes what in the world that documentary is, because I will absolutely watch that one. If you know the name of it, pop it in there.
Maybe we could do a client event or something where we host a showing of the documentary and then I'll drink whiskey.
Done. I'll host that one. I'll host that one. Well, I think, guys, we are about at that time. So we're going to go ahead, and Sarah, I will. Yep, I think we're at that time.
Good way here. All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the virtual learning course, 5 Techniques for Delivering Winning Virtual Shortlist Presentations. My name is Sarah Snavely with Timmons Group, and I will be moderating today's session. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. This program will be provided both via audio and web conference, and will last approximately 45 minutes, followed by a Q&A session at the end. If you have questions at any point during today's session, feel free to submit them via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please note that this presentation is worth 1 AIA LU credit. Certificates of completion and credit submission will be done upon request. Should you require either of these, please reach out to us after the presentation is over. Contact information will be listed on the last slide. And now on to the good stuff. Shortlist presentations are the make it or break it phase of any pursuit. It's the moment when your team can connect with decision makers, demonstrate expertise, communicate approach to solving client issues, and develop rapport. Driving these points is enough to induce stress in even the most seasoned technical professional. In this new normal, communicating those points is simply not enough. To win, teams participating in virtual shortlist presentations must deliver in new, more choreographed ways. Today, we will dive into 5 techniques that will help deliver winning and fully virtual shortlist presentation. Now here's a clue. Just using the same approach as an in-person shortlist presentation will not deliver a win. And now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speakers, Tim Clebundi and Sylvia Montgomery from Timmons Group. Tim, take it away.
Thank you. And Sylvia, not every day we get introduced as the good stuff. I'm going to take this. Sarah, don't give that up. Keep that one going with the good stuff. I'm definitely appreciating it. Like a lot of you on in the webinar today, I started my first interview in 2001. It was, I walked into the room, got to meet a bunch of people, shook hands. Back in 2001, we were setting up PowerPoint projectors, getting out the cables, getting everything set up, probably about 10 minutes before the actual meeting itself. At exactly start time, let's say it was 2:30 in the afternoon, since I'm Eastern Standard, and that's what time it is right now. We presented for about 45 minutes, and after the presentation was done, we stood inside the room and talked and spoke with the people inside the room, probably for about 20 to 30 minutes even afterwards, as we were getting up and just kind of chatting about the project, but not just about the project. We chatted about all sorts of things. And I will say I'm lucky in that first interview I ever sat in out the gate. I actually won that interview. I've lost my fair share along the way, but won that first interview I ever sat in. But I remember reflecting back on it and thinking about it, and in retrospect, realizing that the reality is we won that interview in the 20 minutes that happened after the interview. In other words, it was the relationships that we started building and developing in that period of time that really made the difference for winning that interview. And so today we're going to talk about something that most of you probably haven't dove into too much during your careers, which is we're going to be talking about the advent of the virtual interview. And I'll start off with one piece of interesting information that will make a big difference, and that it's this. It's that virtual interviews almost always favor the incumbent on a particular pursuit. In other words, they almost always favor the firm that already has the relationship, that's already been inside the door, because you don't have that opportunity to connect and build the relationship that you do outside of that environment. Now, at Timmons Group, we have actually been doing virtual interviews for well over a decade. It actually just has something to do with one particular business line we have, and that's how we win a lot of that work, is through virtual interviews. So this is not new news to Timmons Group. We've been doing this for a very, very, very long time. And then likewise, my co-host today, Sylvia, has been doing virtual interviews. Well, actually, you didn't just do virtual interviews. You actually did interview training at Hinge Consulting, which you were one of the founders of, and then really went out not just at interview training, but also won the majority of your jobs that you did through virtual interviews. They were things that happened in a context similar to this, where you were looking at people. And we're going to be diving in today exactly what it means to succeed in virtual interviews.
You're right, Tim. So, while in my 10 years at Hinge, I grew a practice that was 90% virtual when it came to dealing with clients. It was actually a treat to be able to go to a client's office. So, and I was doing that in a period of time when it went against conventional wisdom. I would tell people this is how the business is growing, and they would be like, oh, no, particularly in AEC, you can't do that. You have to sit in front of the person, you have to shake their hand, and you have to connect with them. And the reality was that I was able to connect with them, and I still have very good relationships with, a number of those folks that became clients first, and ultimately became friends. So it just goes to say that we're now all in this actual scenario, and we must use the technology to deliver the presentation that's going to win our business. So with that said, today we're going to focus on things like getting into that virtual mindset. How do you get in the zone of we're going to do this and it's going to be virtual, and we're going to be able to create a rapport. We're going to be able to engage our audience. So those are two additional topics that we'll be talking within that that sphere. And then we're going to talk about balancing the use of visual aids with the time that you spend FaceTime. And finally, we're going to wrap it up with some technology and some critical aspects of that setup. At the very end, we're going to do a Q&A section. So, be ready. Feel free to submit your chats on that and in the chat feature of Zoom. And also, we'll be sending out slides to the group. So let's get going.
I will say one thing that we're not going to be talking about today is we're not going to be talking about the basis of what you guys have been doing for a very long time in interviews. We're not going to rehash, what you need on slides or how to structure. What we're literally going to focus in on is these virtual interviews. And I will say, one of the things I really want to make certain you walk away with today is that this is about relationships. Actually, there's an individual, Scott Ginsing. He is an expert on approachability. His story of how he became an expert on approachability is one of the things that is probably one of the most interesting choices that someone could make, which was back in college, Scott was taking a class on psychology. And in that psychology class, they did an experiment. And the experiment was pretty simple. The experiment was just that he was going to wear a name tag for 3 days. No matter what he was doing, no matter where he was, he had a name tag on. And so he went out on campus, and he found it was really interesting. Day 1, day 2, he'd be walking across the quad on campus, and people would just walk up to him and say, "Hey, Scott, how are you doing?" And it was all because he had this name tag on. And, fast forward, he made a very interesting decision that changed his life, and I think he would agree it changed his life, at day 4, which was he chose not to take his name tag off. As of today, he has had his name tag on for 7,117 days. And I got to be careful with this, Sylvia, as I'm sitting here, because I'm giving statistics, but everybody's sitting at a computer, so this can all be double checked. So 7,117 days, that he's been wearing this name tag, and like what he found out in all this things, actually what he found out, two things. One was that as long as he had a name tag on, he couldn't get a date to save his life. That's probably not relevant to our conversation here. The second piece, though, to it was that he found that name tags were about the person he was talking to. They weren't about himself. In other words, they were for the person he was talking to. Well, the first thing I want to talk to you about with regards to shortlist interviews that are virtual is you have to start and have to have your camera on during a shortlist interview. This is about a relationship. It's about making a connection with somebody. And we're trying to get as close to that as we possibly can. And those cameras allow you to make that interaction. Now, one of the things you're going to see Sylvia and I doing today, which I don't know what to say about this. This just might be your personality. My personality is that we're both hand talkers. But you'll notice this entire time that we're not going to be sitting here and just kind of steadily giving you information back to you. No, the idea is, how do you make certain that you're interacting and engaging with your audience, in this case, in the virtual context, in the virtual meeting, in this virtual interview, back and forth, and making certain those cameras are on is a really important part of that. Making certain that you're animated and using your hands and getting engaged in what you're doing is very, very, very important. Obviously, actually, Sylvia is going to spend a whole section later talking about technology, but I do want to say this, is that microphones become a very important part of what we're going to be talking about as well. And making certain that your setup with regards to your microphone is true to you. You'll notice I don't have anything on my face right now. I'm using a Jambra speaker is what I'm using at the moment. And it's trying to recreate as much as possible just a personal tone, a personal relationship, and that interaction that you would have if we were not to be sitting in front of a virtual context. That said, so those are some things we're trying to create the relationship, but there's some benefits here to being virtual as well. And I don't want to miss the benefits to it. So as I speak right now, you'll see that I am actually reading from the top of my screen. Now, I haven't been reading before this, and I haven't been reading after this, but right now I'm using a cheat sheet that's sitting at the top of my screen. We have a gentleman, his name is Scott Wiley. Scott Wiley was just out on site and had to video record himself walking down, talking about a project that we were taking a video snapshot of. And as he was talking and walking, he was unbelievably perfect in what he was saying. And we followed up with him afterwards and said, what is it? Why in the world did you have to take 20 cuts of that, 20 takes in order to get a good recording? And he said, no, for his iPhone, which we use for most of our recording here as iPhones for video, he just bought an app that worked as a teleprompter across his screen. And that same idea is what I just now was doing when I was reading across the top of my monitor a minute ago, is that the technology also gives us added benefits that we've never had inside of virtual presentation before. So in the past, you'd have to sit there and you have to have all this content memorized and be, on top of your game. Well, you can still be on top of your game now, but you can use a lot of cheat sheets that other people don't even necessarily have to know that you're using as you're engaged in the interview process. So technology doesn't make for a winning presentation, but it's really important that we leverage the technology to be successful in what we're actually communicating. So, as you look at this, what's it look like? Well, first off, you'll note that as we've been talking, you've been looking at Sylvia, you've been looking at me as we've been going through, and as we're going to be putting up these slides. As we're going through the presentation, you'll notice what we're putting up is only what it takes for about 90 seconds for you to digest that slide. Sylvia and I, this entire time, are not going to be hiding behind our PowerPoint presentation. Actually, I should be in the top right-hand corner of your screen right now as you're digesting what's on here. It's kind of reinforcing, cameras on, images and supporting your story, and basically using that idea of cheating. And this is how we want to make certain that we're focused in on the relationships inside, is making certain that we're focused in on what is it that's taking, how do we leverage the technology to do even better at connecting with our audience.
You're right, Tim. And, you know, the technology is simply just the vehicle, but the success is going to come in the actual delivery and the content of your presentation. So with that said, you know, now we move on to the phase of, it's a very different environment for creating rapport, but we want to create as much rapport as possible with the meeting participants, even though we're all at a distance. So just as you would under any normal, you know, shortlist presentation, you want to learn as much as possible about the potential audience. You know, that selection committee that's going to be in the room. You would go on LinkedIn, you would do some research, maybe you look back over the notes of the prior meeting you had with them. But again, you kind of want to get back into that frame of mind of these are the individuals that are going to be in the room. And what else, you know, can I learn about them? For example, if you are presenting to me and you saw this little postcard right here of Minnie Mouse, you might ask me, hey, Sylvia, you know, when was the last time you went to Disney World? And I would completely go into a story about, you know, my trip just like a month and a half ago, right before this whole pandemic started, to celebrate my granddaughter's 4th, you know, leap day birthday. So you would find out a little bit more about me than maybe, well, definitely not something that you would have been able to pick up on LinkedIn. So as you're looking at those individuals, once you're in front of them, you know, via the camera, kind of look for cues where you can connect with them. You also want to mimic the audience that you're going to be presenting to. And what I mean by that is, you know, ahead of time, hopefully you've connected with a point of contact, you know, from the selection committee, and you have identified whether they're going to be dialing in from the office building. Are they all in a conference room, socially distanced? Are they dialing in from their respective offices, but apart? Are they dialing in from their home? How many individuals are going to be in that presentation? Because you want to do as much as possible to mimic them so that it's kind of like a one-to-one scenario. Just as you would in a normal, you know, shortlist presentation, if there's going to be, you know, 5 people on the selection committee, you don't want to bring in 8 people. So you kind of want to gauge that and be very mindful. So that mimicking is important because it's a kind of sets almost like a very balanced environment for both sides. You want to maintain eye contact, just like I'm doing here and Tim is doing. We're looking into the camera. That can feel a little bit awkward because you think you want to be talking to Tim in his Zoom box, but really you want to be talking to the camera so that everybody feels like you're having that one-on-one connection to them. We've run into scenarios, as a matter of fact, already where the selection committee has their video turned off, which that can be quite traumatic. So we're going to talk about how you prepare for that when it comes to the technology and all that a little bit later on. But the idea is, you know, there's nothing you can do about that. Hopefully that will not happen to you. But if you do have to present with the video turned off, you want to behave as if that video is on. You want to be speaking clearly. You want to be sitting up straight. You want to be mindful of everything that they are seeing. And that goes into the background as well. You also want to be relatable. You want to be human. I gave you the example of Minnie Mouse. And as you look to creating that rapport, you want to keep in mind that people learn in different ways. So for example, for the auditory learners, this is a great setup. They're hearing us speak, they're seeing us, so they'll be able to retain certain bits of information. Just as Tim showed a little while ago, we're gonna have a recap slide. That is a great tool for those individuals that learn best by seeing visuals. So we got 2 of the 3 styles covered. But what about those individuals that learn best by engaging, by participating in what's happening? Well, you want to make sure that you address them as well. So a technique that we would suggest is, you know, we understand that you're going to have your own selection criteria form that you may be filling out, but we encourage you to take notes along the way so that if there's something that you want to discuss at a later time, you know, you kind of keep that front of mind. We would even suggest that you do something as simple as a Ben Franklin list. You know, maybe it's a plus and a minus, line down the middle. And if as we say things that are of interest to you, you know, put them in the plus category. Hopefully there won't be anything in the minus category. But again, you're just giving them some suggestions so that if there's someone in the room that's like, oh, wow, this is not conducive for me, you're almost giving them the out and reminding them that there is something that they can do to help themselves. And, you know, finally, as you go into creating this rapport, don't apologize at the onset as to why we're doing this. We all know why we're doing this. We all know why we're virtual. And I would offer that if you start out with an apology, it can almost create doubt in the mind of the selection committee audience, because it kind of then brings to mind, well, are these folks comfortable with online? You know, what if we have to maintain the social distancing for some period of time, or what if we have to do it again later on? You know, so you don't want to create any amount of doubt in that selection committee, but you do want to focus on bringing some rapport. So again, to recap, technique number 2, how human can you be? Do you have any clues in your own environment that kind of point to some of the things that are of interest to you? You know, Tim talked about his cars when we were bantering early on. That's another cue in his office. You know, you want to research the audience and try to connect with them as much as possible. You want to be clear in your speaking. You don't want to just kind of like go off like this and mumble and then. Because when you mumble, the person on the receiving end is just straining and they don't know if what you said, maybe it was important, maybe it was interesting, really interesting to them. So again, enunciate and be deliberate in your speech. Look into the video camera, and at the end of the day, just relax and smile and have some fun.
You know, one of my one of the partners here at Tim's group, his name is Drew Gold. I've actually sat in a lot of meetings with Drew Gold over the last, especially the last 6 weeks. I don't know if we put it that way, but a lot of virtual meetings. And you know, Drew is one of those really, he's probably one of the most patient guys you'll ever meet. And one of the hardships with sitting inside a meeting, or a Zoom meeting is what we use here with Drew, is that if he is looking to say something, I can just keep talking straight over him. And one thing that I've learned is really helpful is watching for the unmute. And that is simply, we're sitting in a Zoom meeting and I will see his unmute drop off on his screen. And I know that's my opportunity to give it a moment and just say, hey, Drew, is there something you wanted to add to that? Or did you have something that looked like you might have had something you wanted to say? Now, I'm not doing that, you know, I'm not calling out, I saw you unmuted or something like that. You know, no, what I'm doing is I'm using, again, that technology just to engage with and see if there's an opportunity to try and get back and forth with our audience. Now, that works in virtual interviews extraordinarily well, where you can see one of the panelists drop off their unmute, a really good reason to keep your eye on that. It also works when you're talking with a client and the unmute drops and there's no video camera on, going back to what Sylvia was just now talking a minute ago. So really being aware and keeping track of mutes and unmutes. Now, I'll tell you a little secret. This piece of our presentation right now has nothing to do with muting and unmuting your phone. Instead, this is all about active transitions that work. So, if you looked at somebody who hadn't done very many interviews before, they often will do a handshake transition. It's where I would sit here and say, Sylvia is now going to talk to you about this. And then I would sit here and say, well, thank you, Sylvia. And now on to this topic. Well, when we're in virtual interviews, we don't want to be doing these handshakes as we're going on. Interesting enough, I would actually say you don't want to do that in a regular interview either. But really, it's about making certain that your client feels like it's a dialogue and a discussion going back and forth. Now, Sylvia and I have been through this presentation several times before now. And as we've gone through it, we know where she's going to drop off, where I'm going to pick up, hopefully just like you're going to as you do your interview prep. But we know basically where we're going to be picking up and dropping off, but we are using the technique of the active pause. And the pause is just that idea of when I'm done talking and it's Sylvia's turn to pick up, I'm simply putting a pause in. That way, there's the opportunity for her to jump in on a dialogue instead of it looking like an overly formal presentation. Now, the same thing is what we've noted, especially with clients, and why this is so important comes true with our clients, which is if we don't give those pauses during a presentation, we can't end up with the great dialogue back and forth that we have when we're dealing with a client one-on-one. As we've been sitting here talking, we've actually had several comments coming through. Thanks for the comments. Keep them coming. We're doing questions and answers at the end. But it's this idea of there's this desire to engage and to connect. And if you don't use those active pauses, you're going to miss out on that opportunity. Now, I do want to say this, is that if you're working with a junior architect, a junior engineer, a junior superintendent, someone that has 5 years of experience, and they still need the active handshake transition, absolutely go right ahead and do it if that's what's going to help them know, and feel more comfortable. But really, for a virtual interview, you really want to try and hold off on those types of interactions. The other thing I do want to say is that really, again, this comes down to relationships. We're trying to get a dialogue. We're trying to get interaction. In order to be relational, you have to act relational. So as you're going through your presentations and as you're connecting with your audience, making certain that you are, giving those pauses and doing that really is going to make a big difference. So for a recap, making certain that you're using active pausing to help the interaction. You're going to be looking for that mute and unmute, but really your focus is going to be on being relational. And this last piece, Sylvia, I think you were the one that taught me this, is that we want our clients to walk away with that feeling of, I want to work with them. And we do that through how we're interacting and how we're working with them back and forth as we are in the virtual interview.
And we talk a lot about fostering engagement because it is so important. In professional services, it's all about the relationships. Of course, you want to work with people that have the experience, have the capabilities, but at the end of the day, you want to work with people that, you get along with. So fostering the engagement is really, really important. And we know going into this, just as, we talked about earlier, that if you're an incumbent, it's a lot easier for you. You have that relationship. But when you're not the incumbent, there's a lot to overcome. And if you're going, up for an opportunity and you're not the incumbent, and the first time you're doing this with them is virtually, it's a mountain to climb. So a lot of what we're focusing on is, tips and tricks to develop that rapport and foster the engagement. So remember at the onset of our meeting today, we were just kind of bantering as people were coming on, into the Zoom room. Well, that banter is mimicking what would happen during the setup. And as folks are coming into the room, as the selection committee is coming in the room, and everybody's just kind of gathering. So, not the same, but trying to mimic as much as possible.
It's amazing. I'm looking at at some of the comments and some things going back and forth. I think we have way too many people talking about bourbon, which I think was part of the goal, right? We wanted to create that interaction back and forth, which is exactly what happened. It just was all about bourbon. That was the only problem.
Well, no, that's true. And, again, it's just a comfort that comes with that banter. So it's inherently setting the stage for a comfortable interaction, just as you would if you were, in the same room. Let's also, when you're talking about fostering that engagement, let's look at some of the setup things. We've mentioned that we're going to talk a lot about our setup a little bit later on, but you want your background to be, somewhat clean, professional, not distracting. Again, Tim and I have very different approaches at our setup, but again, they're all very clean. There's no distractions amongst them. We've closed our, all of our social media, all of our outlooks, everything is closed for that matter as well. But you want to see, when it comes to virtual backgrounds, they're very popular right now and they're cool. Let's face it, they're cool. They're great for internal meetings, but we do not recommend using that from a professional setting. So in a selection committee meeting, we don't recommend that you have a virtual background. We just recommend that you look at your lighting. We're going to talk about lighting a little bit later on. You look at your setup. You keep it very professional. And the reason, because the reason why the virtual background doesn't work as well is because depending on your internet connection and how fast and well that is working, if you have a background such as that, they tend to pixelate and kind of look a little bit jaggy around the edges with movement. If somebody holds up a piece of paper, it doesn't show well against the background, for example. So just a couple of reasons why we don't recommend the virtual background in an actual meeting. When it comes to also fostering engagement, you want to leave some openings to have, you know, the selection committee or another member of your team jump in, just as Tim just did. You know, I had one of my colleagues tell me that they were part of a virtual presentation we were in as a sub, and as a team, they had 70 minutes to present, but they had 110 slides. So can you just imagine, you know, rule of thumb tells you should spend no more than a minute per slide. Less is great, but somebody's talking really fast. And that means that you're definitely losing that engagement that you had with your audience, because all they're seeing is slide after slide after slide. They're not engaging with the presenters. So, you know, you have to be mindful of how is the presentation structured differently than if you were in the room. If you were in the room, people would be walking, they would be standing, they may be looking over plans. And even though that was the allotted time, it could move faster in their eyes because they're engaged in different ways. But when we are in a virtual setting, you know, if all the recipient sees is slide after slide after slide, it creates a different mindset, and it's one of, you know, not a strong engagement. So kind of keep that in mind. You also want to predetermine who's going to field the questions. We're going to share with you a little bit about how we're handling that here, but you know, we're getting a lot of questions already, a lot of raised hands. So who's going to field that? In an interview, typically you would want your project manager to field the questions. You know, they're going to be the team lead, they're going to be the project manager, but in a setting like this, you want to consider, is that really feasible? Does it detract from their role? So you want to keep the, you know, get those considerations on the table ahead of time. So again, fostering engagement is so important, because at the end of the day, when you finish that presentation, you want to have a strong closing. You want to ask for the work. You want to say, you know, we are so excited about, you know, working with you on this project, and we are ready to start, and we really want to work with you. And you want to have the very strong closing. You don't want to leave, you know, in a note that's less than optimistic, excited, and forward-looking. So to recap, technique number 4, it's all about fostering engagement. You know, ask questions of your audience as well. For example, you know, Renee, you know, we included some aspects of landscape architecture because we know you guys are very excited about incorporating that in your project. It's okay to call out one of the, you know, individuals in the selection committee, especially if you know that there is a piece of your presentation that is of particular interest to them. And just on the off chance they were fading away, you know, you just pull them in again. Focus your eyes on the video camera. You want to see them, they want to see you talking to them. Predetermine who's going to field the questions. Make sure that you have a background that is not distracting. And at the end of the presentation, have a very strong closing.
You know, one of my favorite companies, you know, from a marketing standpoint, is a company by the name of Blendtec. They actually have a great story. It's how they got into doing what they're doing is probably what makes them so interesting. First off, for those of you that don't know who Blendtec is a blender company. You usually wouldn't think of them as a traditional blender company. You would think of them as if you were in a manufacturing facility and you had chemicals you needed to blend together, or you know, or if you were in, you know, manufacturing food and you had a massive volume of product that you're blending together. Blendtec would be the company who you would probably be buying a blender from. Well, about 12 years ago, they wanted to start a new part of their company, which was selling their blenders to consumers. And the problem with selling these blenders to consumers is that their least expensive blender, I think, is $400. Most of their blenders for consumers are around $800. And I don't know how many of you on this call would be overly willing to spend $400 to $800 on a blender. And so this was something they were struggling with and trying to really figure this out. And in one of the days that the owner of Blendtec was just really frustrated, he was doing what honestly he always did when he was frustrated, which was he would go back into their into one of their rooms where they had their blenders, and he would just start blending stuff. I don't know how to better say it. There's some, there's some strange things that they would blend at Blendtec. He would go in with a hockey stick and he would blend a hockey stick. He would do all sorts of things. And the marketing person was walking past, and all of a sudden, she had the light bulb moment and went and ran and got a video camera and recorded what was actually what he was actually blending at that point in time. And that really, that one piece, that one decision transformed what the company was doing. I'll show you an example here.
That is the question. I love my new iPhone. It does everything. But will it blend? That is the question. Let's find out. I think I'm going to push the smoothie button. I smoke. Don't breathe this.
Now, I don't know what all of you were doing 12 years ago, but I guarantee you everybody remembers that when this video came out, there were literally lines of people wrapped around iPhone stores all across the US, waiting in line for their brand new iPhone all at the same time while Blendtec was deciding to blend it, which, by the way, Sylvia, I'm always impressed with what in the world that thing looks like at the end of the day. I mean, come on, that's an iPhone. I would never believe it. Anyways, so they came out with all of these different types of things that they were blending. And by the way, this particular video got 12 million views, and you'll never guess what started happening. They started selling $400 to $800 blenders. Like they were going out of style, by the way. And it's all because they figured out how to tell their story. And the telling the story is what we have to figure out and learn to do in a virtual interview. Now, back up 4 months, and an architect and engineer, any of us that, in this profession could have walked into a room and laid out a plan set in front of a client and had this great interaction telling the story about what happened in a project that we had done before, or what could be done. Well, we still have to figure out how do we tell that story. Now, the good news is we have a whole lot of different mediums that we can use because we're using technology like this today. Because we're sitting here and able to sit and just share off of this, but you still can do and make certain that you're sharing that story. Put up the PDF of the project site, put up the PDF of the layout that you've built out, but make certain you remember that a lot of your clients are probably, a lot of the people viewing you are probably going to be on a 14-inch screen, right? So you're going to have to make certain you're zooming into certain parts of that plan set, really looking at and identifying the graphics and images, but you need to make certain that you're using those strong images. And the goal of those images is to reinforce your message. Those of you that have heard me speak before or written or read anything that I've written, you'll know that one of my favorite analogies here is that a picture is worth 1,000 words. And 1,000 words, that means when we're putting something into a presentation, we're able to really communicate all these things inside that image. The other thing, which takes it one step further, is that a story is a lot of pictures. And if you can paint a picture with your story, you can share so much more information if you can focus in on being a great storyteller and sharing stuff as you go through. I will say one other really important thing that makes this work is a Sarah. Now, a Sarah is probably, I hate to tell you, one of the most important things in the presentation we have going on right now. And that's because behind the scenes, Sarah.
Say that again, Tim?
Yeah, I'm getting back to you here. You know, you started off nice. Yes. So Sarah is actually running this entire presentation. You know, I've seen lots of people asking questions. Actually, Robin, earlier in the presentation, I saw this question go up. You didn't see me sitting here typing any responses to any questions. Sarah's been doing all of the behind the scenes work on this. And if you're running into an interview, the Sarah becomes the third person in the room that becomes so valuable and important. And I'm going to go back to that interview in 2001 and all the ones that you guys, you know, especially over a decade and a half ago, when we used to be running the latest technology at that time, which was a PowerPoint projector. And as you're going in, you would oftentimes have someone else in the room that would set up the projector, make certain PowerPoint was running correctly, make certain everything was smooth and flowing, so that you could focus in on the relationship in the room, right? You didn't want your principal or the project manager having to fumble around with a projector when they could be shaking hands with the client and getting to know them. And that becomes the same key that becomes really important during the virtual interview. So here it is. First off, based on, you know, Sarah matters when it comes to our presentations, and that Sarah becomes one of the most important aspects of doing a virtual presentation. Second thing is making certain you're telling those stories and using pictures, because there became so many points of interaction. Those strong images reinforce your message and reiterate your story to your client. And those are the key pieces that are going to help you make certain that your client actually knows who you are and follows who you are from where you're at.
Exactly. So, you know, we've talked a lot about creating the rapport. We've talked about engaging the audience. You know, hopefully you've also gotten a sense of how we balance, you know, the technology, you know, the FaceTime with the slides. And along the way, instead of telling you, this is what we're doing right now and what we'd like you to do, we've just shown you. We've shown you the pauses, the interactions, all of that. But now it's time to just step back and really dive into this whole technology piece, because there are so many components to it. It is just mind-numbing. So we talked about the background a little bit. Again, a clean, professional, hopefully a little bit of personality. You want to also consider, as part of your setup in your box, you know, the attire you're wearing. I'm a little bit short, so I'm not really sure that you can tell that I'm wearing a Timmins shirt, but that's a consideration. You know, I'm a big believer of subliminal messages, so anything that you can do to send a subliminal message is fabulous. We want to look at the wiring. So a week ago when we started practicing for this, you know, one of our practices, I was doing it over Wi-Fi and I was breaking up. So the lesson learned, go ahead, get a 100-foot wire, run it through the house, and now I'm completely hardwired into the router. So those are
first
some—
floor to second floor?
First floor to second floor, exactly. You know, we talk about practicing. So of course, under any circumstances, in person or not, you want to practice. You want to practice as you're going to perform on the day of. But here's the difference when it comes to virtual presentations. You also want to practice in the platform that your presentation will be in. So let's say your company uses Zoom a lot, just like we do, and you've practiced in Zoom, great. You guys have it all choreographed. It's all, you know, laid out. You're good to go. Have you practiced in the platform of choice that is going to be used on the day of? Well, what if that is WebEx? For example, Zoom lets you have multiple hosts. So if one person goes down, you know, somebody else can jump in. WebEx doesn't allow you to do that. So if the host goes down, you have a situation. So you want to know the nuances of the platform that you're going to be using. Hopefully, you're always going to be able to drive that selection of platform, but it doesn't happen all the time. Another thing you want to consider is the lighting. You know, a lot of people tend to have yellow lights in their house. That's great, but if you change some of the lights in the room, or all of the lights if possible in the room that you're presenting from, to white, all of a sudden you get a little bit of a crisper setup, and it takes away that yellowish glow. So those are just some considerations in your setup and dry run. We talked about the cloud platform. There's a number of them out there. They're all different. So whenever possible, again, you want to be the host, but it doesn't always work out that way. So as you have a point of contact that you're corresponding with prior to the presentation, you want to find out, you know, what is the platform that we're going to be using, which leads us into, as you're corresponding with that point of contact from the selection committee, you want to find out what their requirements are and what their expectations are. Are they expecting anything ahead of time, any pre-read materials, or are they open to receiving some pre-read materials? For example, if they are, maybe they would be open to receiving a simple PDF, like a placemat, with pictures of the individuals that are presenting, maybe some notes about their area of specialization, a space for them to take notes. Again, that does put a little bit of ownership on them, because then they might have to print that PDF, or maybe they're all comfortable using it as just a PDF. But again, you want to try to get as much information as possible prior to the actual event. On the day of the event, you want to log in ahead of time. Again, you want to log in at least 15 minutes, just so that you know that on the day of, the technology is working. Just as Tim, Sarah, and myself have done today, we've muted our phone, we've closed all the pop-ups, everything has been closed to minimize any unwanted interruptions. We've also muted ourselves when we're not speaking. Again, you want to create as clean of an environment as possible for the environment, for the person that's presenting. And if appropriate, and you've already sorted this out with your point of contact, you will have a Q&A moderator. You will have your own Sarah that can be fielding some questions for when you get to that part of the presentation. So there's a lot of technology considerations. Again, we're just touching at a very high level, but the worst thing you can do is just kind of show up on the day of, and not having tested out these backgrounds and setups. And of course, you want to have a plan B.
Yeah, unfortunately, I've learned the plan B one the hard way. I think the first time I had a plan B was I was at an interview and the bulb went out on the projector. I don't think a bulb can go out anymore on a projector, but it certainly was the case when they used to be halogen bulbs instead of LEDs. Well, the interesting thing about virtual interviews is that there's not really anything, there's no such thing as plan B. It's actually much more in depth when you're talking about a virtual interview. So we're actually going to talk about plan B as plan B, plan C, and plan D, because virtual interviews are very, very, very different setup than what you would normally do. You're not just going to walk in with the old-fashioned, I have a hard copy print up, and if my projector goes down, hand everybody a book that's the PowerPoint. Not the case at all. So let's walk through these. Plan A, first off, everything goes according to plan. We're good to go. We don't have to worry about that. That is the ideal. The second is going to be plan B. And plan B really has to do with this thing. So if your Wi-Fi goes down in your house, actually you're not Wi-Fi'd in, you're supposed to be plugged in, then per Sylvia's comment a minute ago. But if your internet goes down, if there's any problem, plan B is simply to swipe down from the top of your phone and turn on your mobile hotspot. Now, we're not going to give the entire interview from the hotspot, because if I'm doing that, all of a sudden I'm creating the instability of the internet. In other words, we could have pixelation. We could have lots of different problems according to that. But as a plan B, that hotspot becomes a great, great, great backup. The plan C goes into if my computer goes down. So plan B really is if my internet goes down. Plan C is if my computer goes down. And if my computer goes down, I again am using this, and I've already got my cell phone preloaded with, in this case, it would be Zoom Webinar or Zoom or WebEx or GoToMeeting or whatever it is, that app. And I'm simply going to switch over to the app that's on my cell phone, put it in front of me, and keep going. Now, is running off of an app ideal? Absolutely not. But that's why we call it Plan B, Plan C, is because we're coming up with what are the ways that we can make certain that we're prepared for anything that comes along. Now, Plan D, I really hope none of you ever make it to Plan D, but Plan D is a dial-in number. And it's never the ideal, but it is certainly something that has happened to more than one person, I guess you'll say. So making certain that you're ready with that dial-in. So again, Plan B is hotspots, Plan C is using your apps, and Plan D is dial-in. Now, remember what Sylvia said a minute ago, which is multiple hosts. If you are on GoToWebinar and your host goes down, the entire presentation goes down. A lot of these are starting to fix this, but today, actually, Sarah and I are the two hosts. That means Sarah's in Charlotte, North Carolina. If that goes down, we're good. I'm in Richmond, Virginia. If we go down here, we're still good. We still have a host. And the other is making certain you have client phone numbers. So if something goes down on their end, we want to very rapidly be able to jump in and help them and make certain we keep that interview online. Slides at the ready. When I say at the ready, I mean they're ready to email. If we have a breakdown with a client, they have to maintain that same time slot. What we'll be ready to do is email those slides out very, very rapidly. And the last piece, the most important piece, I hope you guys are getting this, is to have a Sarah, because Sarah is the one running everything behind the scenes as we're talking and making certain that the presentation is smooth, that what we're talking about is smooth, and that everything goes according to plan while we're able to focus in on what the task at hand is.
You know, and having a plan B is not just important for the presentation, but what I love about it is the subliminal message that it sends. And it says, you know, this firm that is presenting has anticipated every possible scenario. They've come to the table prepared and they know what to do. And what better feeling to leave at the end of the presentation than to have the folks in the room be able to see that, be able to see the preparedness and take away the message that you're going to be just as equally prepared when you're working on their project. So I just love that. I love that.
Very good. All great information. We do have a lot of questions on technology right now. One being the teleprompter. Do you guys have one that you prefer over the other? One for Android, one for iPhone? What do you use?
So what we'll do is for folks that, you know, want to get that information, feel free to just shoot an email. We're gonna have an email here in a second, and we'll just send you a couple. We'll send you an app for Apple and one for Android. Again, we're not endorsing one over the other. We're not making any money out of it, but there's just a couple we have found.
Now, Tim, one specifically for you.
All right, sorry about that. I was having some of my own virtual issues on my computer. Are we ready for Q&A?
Yes.
And everyone, please put your questions in the chat box.
And as everybody is doing that, you'll notice that I went ahead and posted the information on the apps because that was the most commonly asked question the last time.
So far, nothing yet in the chat rooms, but I will say, Sylvia, that was a pretty interesting and informative presentation about some of these pointers. I guess I failed. I have too much clutter in my background. And Margaret matters.
Yes, she does.
helping run this background.
With some of the things, I guess some, do you have any suggestion of how to kind of present? I was trying to, I wrote some notes here about it, and kind of, and it's probably more in particular with your architectural firms too, but kind of have this passive creativeness and with purpose. Is there, do you have any recommendation like how not to overstate humor or get too far lost in being creative? Is there any kind of middle ground for that? Oh, we do have a question.
Yeah, I mean, like, for example, in hindsight, you know, for us recording the presentation, we probably started the banter too early. So it was a little bit long, it felt a little bit long. But I think part of, you also need to know like who you're presenting to, because if you're the incumbent and you have relationships with the audience, that's obviously going to allow you to do a different banter than if it's somebody that you've never met before. So I would judge the creativity, you know, and the topic selection and, you know, how you just go about the whole thing based on what you know of the audience primarily.
Understood. I do have a question from our chat box. The question is, should you prepare an outline for those in the audience who might have a hearing or visual impairment?
Absolutely. I mean, and that's why we also gave the example of the apps. Another example is just have little outlines sitting right over the laptop, like in a little stand, because that's going to be helpful to the presenter. You know, even if it's someone that doesn't have a hearing or a visual impairment, it's going to help them stay on track. But I would definitely recommend it, you know, for anybody. Because the great thing about the virtual, if I can just reiterate, is that nobody sees what you have around you to remind you of what to say. So take advantage of it.
Can't go on.
Yeah, I think there's another one popped up here. Another question, I'll ask another question. How do you, I know sometimes when I've done presentations in the past and you're kind of on a vein there where you continue to talk, how do you stop? Do you have any recommendations on how to stop rambling on?
You know, that requires a lot of tactfulness. Right now, I'm working with the team to prepare for a shortlist presentation. And one of the principals, he's a talker, you know, he's a talker. And, you know, finding the way virtually. So hopefully that person might be in the same room with somebody else. Maybe they're in the office. So the other person can serve as the timekeeper, if you will. Worst case scenario is, you know, the moderator of the presentation can do something, you know, kind of joking and say, okay, I know, Chris, I know you're so passionate about this, but we got to keep going because we want to be mindful of the time, you know, and it may force, you know, that kind of injection in the conversation. But I think it's more important, you know, that it's not abrupt, if you would.
I have another question here saying we had an interview recently where we were social distanced in person with 2 panelists, and then 3 panelists unexpectedly were virtual. It was very difficult.
Yeah, and I'm surprised, you know, it'd be interesting to find out the backstory on that, because it's just, that's going to make it really awkward. You know, if I have people on the computer like I am here, and you're looking at them and you're maintaining that eye contact, having people show up in person, it's, you know, it's terribly awkward. And it sounds like a very unfortunate situation at that point. I mean, you're just gonna have to juggle maybe standing up, you know, depending on the computers, you know, the computer setup, maybe standing up so that you're more at the height level of the individuals in the room. Or if they're seated at the table, you know, you look at them, you change back to the computer so that you're making eye contact there. That would by far be the most awkward situation, even worse than having an interview with no video.
Another question that came to my mind is, you know, you have, say in your virtual panel, you have 4 participants. You have kind of the 2 that kind of lead the conversation, but you have the one that's just kind of in the background. And usually at times, if you're that person in the background, you kind of have this anxiousness to say something. So you're not just hanging out there. Do you have any recommendations to do for that person so it doesn't come off like abruptly and interrupt and be all anxious?
I mean, my personal style is I will ask people throughout the presentation, you know, is there anything else that I can tell you about this? Or Joe, is there anything else you'd like to hear? So that's my style. I just do it as a normal course throughout the presentation so that it's not so awkward. You know, Joe has been kind of falling asleep at the corner and, you know, hasn't been paying attention. So that's part of how you develop your style, but that's how I normally do it.
There's another question here. I am hearing impaired. What things could you do to make a virtual experience more meaningful? Could you do a pre-survey in order to see who in the audience might benefit from having a sneak peek at your slides or visual aids?
That's an interesting question because I think that could differ if it's a private client versus a public client. I know sometimes with public clients, you know, they're very protective of sharing who's going to actually be in the presentation. But I would like to think that if they know that part of the presenting team has, you know, someone that's hearing impaired, that they might be open to exactly what you suggest. But you know, I think you just have to play it by ear because that's, you know, part of how public sector, you know, behaves, just even normal conditions, pandemic aside. I think with a private client, it's definitely going to be a lot easier to say, hey, you know, we'd like to do this to accommodate one of our team members. And there's less of that whole, you know, governmental protocol that has to be followed. Let me see, I want to make sure that I answered. I think the pre-survey, obviously sending the slides ahead of time, or maybe if there is even some polls that are done throughout the presentation. You know, depending on the platform you're using, you can inject some polls. So maybe that's one of the things that is done.
Does anybody else have any questions in our chat? I'll just give it a minute here in case someone types something.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Oh, this has been great. Thank you. Okay.
You know, it's interesting because, or sad, depending on how you look at it. You know, when we did the presentation, this was in April. And, you know, I think we're all thinking, okay, this is going to be maybe like a quarter's worth of, you know, experience, and then we're going to go back to normal. Clearly it hasn't. So I did worry that, oh, the presentation is going to be in August. Everything's going to be done by then. And clearly it's not. So I'm glad that we were able to do this and it's still meaningful.
Yes. Yes.
Not glad that we're still dealing with the, you know, working remote though.
Well, I want to say thank you. Thank you, Sylvia, for having this presentation. Like I said, I found it very useful, and a lot of there's some very good pointers in it, and it was an interesting way of presenting it, which was kind of casual, but yet it was informative. Also, one thing I liked about is there was a lot of discussions, but then you kind of circled back with like maybe 4 or 5 power slides, and that was it.
Exactly.
So I really kept the attention and kept it kind of micro-focused on some of the points you were pointing out.
Great. Well, I'm glad that it was useful.
Well, thank you very much. I'll turn it over to Margaret. Another one, thank you, Sylvia, Chris, and thanks for everyone participating. Okay. Sorry. I guess I'll stop in the chat.
Have maybe a dry weekend. I think it's supposed to rain, but
It's already raining here, so it's coming your way.
oh, okay. Well, maybe